Hi, and welcome to GSWS Reads. My name is Tiffany Muller-Myrdal, and I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, and in the Urban Studies program at SFU. This installment of GSWS Reads is an interview with Leslie Kern, author of Feminist City, A Field Guide. To introduce this interview, I'll give a brief overview of the text and some of the context for the questions that Dr. Kern spoke to. First, I want to locate myself and this event, even though it's virtual in format. It is rooted in place to the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, who have been protectors of this land since time immemorial. As an immigrant settler here, originally from the territories of the Oceti-Sakowin, or Dakota, also known as Minneapolis, I endeavor to be a good guest in all of the work that I do, including working for and teaching about a feminist city, which I define as a city where all residents feel safe, have a strong sense of belonging, and have good quality of life that is not threatened by poverty, gender-based violence, lack of housing, and infrastructure that only serves able-bodied people, among many other features that make our cities unsafe in the best case scenario and violently oppressive in the worst. Those who bear the brunt of inequitable urban design and function are those who have been left out of the process of design, the development of service, and governance, especially women, racialized and indigenous people, and people with disabilities. Leslie Kern's Feminist City, A Field Guide is a primer on these issues and how they manifest in a North American and UK context. Written as a first-person account, Kern walks her readers through how she came to understand the shape of cities as spaces that work for few, not for many. Urban infrastructure and urban life has been and in many ways continues to be predicated on the needs of those who have been in the majority as decision makers in government, in planning, in engineering. That is to say, white, able-bodied, cisgendered, heterosexual, middle and upper class men. Kern takes up the form of the city. She writes, "Patriarchy is written in stone." And she takes up the embodied experience of navigating cities, alone, with children, in protest spaces, with friends. She draws on decades of scholarship by feminist geographers and cultural critics, as well as key interventions to activist and policy spaces like the Red Women Rising report produced by Carol Murray Martin and Harsha Walia for Vancouver's Downtown Eastside Women's Center. What makes this book especially important for me, and particularly for its use with students, is its accessibility. Kern's reliance on an autobiographical narrative gives the text the kind of power that academic texts are not usually able to convey. This means that Kern succeeds at getting readers to think about their own experiences in cities and look at them anew, questioning what they've taken to be normal and having curiosity about their everyday encounters with urban life. Kern writes with a distinctly intersectional lens, which means that she centers women and the very distinct ways that women experience cities because of the ways our bodies are marked, or are assumed to be unmarked through the categories of whiteness, certain forms of mobility, presumed heterosexuality, and because of the structural inequities we face and the structural norms with which we are complicit, even if unwittingly. Critically, she positions herself and the privilege and the implicit power with which she moves as a white, cisgendered, able-bodied, middle-class woman, and writes pointedly about how the experience of negotiating urban spaces is markedly different for Black and Indigenous women and men, as well as bodies that are read and are coded as somehow, quote unquote, other than the norm. Those include disabled people, gender fluid people, trans people. She writes, quote, "The extent to which anyone can simply be in urban space tells us a lot about who has power, who feels their right to the city is a natural entitlement, and who will always be considered out of place," end quote. For many readers, These points will raise questions that have not been answered because they've never been asked. This is a consistent message I've heard from students over years of teaching. Feminist geography gives them language for making sense of their everyday lives in the spaces they occupy, whether urban, suburban, or otherwise. Importantly, as students in this seminar pointed out in their reviews of Kern's text, it runs the risk of universalizing the experiences of women in the North American and UK contexts, despite drawing from some important activist work in Chile, India, and elsewhere in the world. However, even international students in the class commented that the power of the text lies in its relatability. There is much that will be recognizable to readers outside of Canada, the US, and the UK. One quick note about the format of the interview. It's more formal than conversational, and that's because our time was quite limited. Leslie Kern is based in New Brunswick, and the course in which this interview took place begins at 5:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So there's a 4-hour time difference, which made it late for Leslie, but she graciously delayed putting on her PJs in order to meet with us. Since we only had 45 minutes, we organized a structured set of questions that emerged from reading the book. As we approach the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, I hope you'll join us in reading Feminist City and use it to examine how and where cities work for women, and how and where there remains a ton of work to be done to imagine and to create equitable cities. Recognizing the importance of lived experience is critical to developing a new imaginary. Early in the book, Kern quotes Adrienne Rich, who said, quote, "Begin with the female body, not to transcend this body, but to reclaim it," end quote. Kern responds, "What are we reclaiming here? We're reclaiming personal lived experience, gut knowledges, and hard-earned truths. A politics of asking women's questions, not essentialist questions based on some false claim to a biological definition of womanhood. Rather, questions that emerge from the everyday embodied experience of those who include themselves in the dynamic and shifting category women." For us, Kern argues, city life generates questions that far too long have gone unanswered. I hope you'll join me in reading this book, asking some new questions, and getting some answers.
So thank you so much, Leslie, for joining us for a discussion of your book. I have the less cool cover, but well read, as you can see. We kind of divided up questions and allotted them, and I think we have them all kind of allotted. So I'll just turn it over to the first person, who I think is Nega.
Yes, actually the first question that I want to ask you is, for those who haven't read the book, could you please lay out what goals you had for the book and what you were hoping the book would accomplish?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and thanks everyone for introducing yourselves. It's nice to meet you over Zoom tonight. So, you know, the book started out honestly as a bit of a whim. I was just kind of like musing in my head, like, what if I was, you know, writing about this, sort of like telling these stories. So it was kind of like a little project that I was doing kind of off the side of my desk. I didn't want to I don't know, I didn't want to start thinking too much about what it might be or where it might go, so that I wouldn't maybe overthink it. But at the same time, I was sort of being inspired by the fact that there's so much like popular feminist nonfiction writing right now that's been having such a great like national, international uptake. So whether we're talking about like Roxane Gay or Rebecca Traister, Rebecca Solnit, Soraya Shamali, like people whose writing is reaching a mainstream audience. And I was sort of thinking like one of the things that as a feminist geographer I could contribute to this conversation about power essentially in society would be this like the space angle, this city angle, right? What do our built environments have to do with the social relations and social inequalities that we see around us? So, you know, I kind of like worked on this book very quietly. I literally did not tell anybody that I was writing this book, like not my partner, not my friends, not my colleagues, until basically I had a book contract. That was when I told people. So it sort of grew kind of organically in that way, and that I wasn't, you know, having this specific aim, because, you know, to be honest, I think that if I was thinking too much about it as a book that was incorporating both personal experience and this sort of, you know, compiling of all sorts of research and theory, that I would on the one hand be worrying both about what my mom would think and then also what my like peers and colleagues would think, and that would just be too much. Like, you would not be able to write a word if I was kind of stuck in between those two sets of worries. But it has, I mean, even just listening to your introductions and seeing that there's this interesting mix of urban studies folks, gender and women's studies folks, and then people from other programs as well, it's like, oh, okay, if this book can speak to these multiple audiences, then I feel like it has accomplished at least some of what I wanted it to. Yeah.
So for our second question, so one of the things that we really appreciated about your approach when you were writing your book was how clearly you situate yourself and the specific set of privileges that you occupy in your experience throughout the city. But in chapter 4, we noticed the description of being excited for your first protest and the prospect of being arrested was one spot where we thought there could maybe be a more thorough unpacking of the privilege that was missing. So we were just hoping you could maybe reflect a bit more on that section, especially in light of the protests that have been happening in the last several months throughout the country and in the States. And just looking back, did you have any sense of how whiteness was operating within those experiences that you were having?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I mean, Tiffany very kindly sent me the questions and let me, you know, kind of decide which ones I wanted to answer. And honestly, you know, when I first saw this question, I was like, but I talked about privilege in that chapter. What are they talking about? But I was like, no, let's have this, totally have this conversation. So it is interesting looking back. I mean, partly there is, honestly, it's like a question of memory as well. You know, this is 25 years ago, some of those specific moments, right? So when you are looking back and trying to capture both like your own feelings and sensations and thoughts, and also remembering like what actually happened, it's remarkably hazy. I mean, most of you are not at the point where you are trying to cast your minds back 25 years to something that happened, but it's not that easy. But your question is a totally valid one. And at the time, you know, even though I was in women's and gender studies, and we definitely had, you know, well, women's studies at the time, as it was, you know, and there was an intersectional lens that had not yet really landed for me in terms of what it would mean for activism, because activism was super new to me at that moment. And it seemed like there was a very clearly defined enemy, right? Like a very clearly, you know, in this case, it was a conservative provincial government that we wanted to protest some of their, you know, new policies and cuts to funding and this sort of thing. And yeah, that sort of view, that sort of questioning of like, who was going to be involved in the protest, what it meant to get arrested, whether that was a privilege. I mean, I think I say in the book, like, it was very naive. And, you know, that's like I can only describe myself in that situation as incredibly naive. But looking back now and knowing a bit more about like women's anti-violence movements and the ways in which they have been in many ways quite exclusionary in many different ways, historically speaking, I can see now that, you know, now if I was doing that, I would be asking a different set of questions about who the organizers are, about what their politics are. But at the moment, it was like, oh no, this is a feminist action. This is good. This is what I'm going to be involved in. And I was very much like swept up in that energy. But yeah, I mean, now you know, one of the things that I often will talk about with my students in like my environmental justice classes, we'll talk about like some of the dynamics, the race and gender dynamics of movements themselves. And I always want to ask them, like, what do you notice about, you know, who gets to like put themselves out there as being on the front lines, as being the most radical, as being willing to get arrested, as being willing to do this and do that, and you know, what aspects of privilege are being embodied there, what kinds of whiteness, masculinity, able-bodiedness, and so on are being reproduced through these kinds of tropes of like who the activist is and what that's supposed to look like. So, you know, now I'm much more like aware of those things. And, you know, I think at the time I also wasn't really, sorry, lost my train of thought there. I guess to sort of, you know, fast forward to the present day, one of the things that I notice both with Black Lives Matter and when I watch like students in particular, they're like climate justice, activism, and so on, there is already a much more intersectional lens just baked right into what young people are doing, right? Like it's not something that I have to tell them or remind them about, you know, when they get up and make speeches. It's, you know, anti-colonial, it's anti-capitalist, it's anti-patriarchy, it's like all there in one piece. Whereas I think there was maybe a sense back when I was first starting out of like protests are like about one thing, right? They're kind of like, you know, we have like pride and, you know, pride related protests over here. We have feminist protests over here. We have labor protests over here. And these things, you know, they kind of interweave, but essentially there's like one theme and we got to follow the theme. But now I don't see that as prevalent, in at least from what I observe now from my like old lady sitting on her lawn kind of vantage point. So, but thanks for the question. Yeah.
I don't know that it's fair to call you an old lady.
Okay.
Ryan?
All right. I think I'm gonna. Well, first, thanks for your answer with that question. I thought that was pretty cool, and I actually have a lot to think about after that answer. So the third question. So I really love the idea of female friendships being a transformative activity, and you referred to both Wonker and Tallbear on their take on how female friendships challenge settler logic and colonial power structures. And I was just wondering if you could provide some examples or thoughts on how this can be practiced in our daily lives.
Yeah, so, I mean, one of the conversations that I've been having a lot with respect to, you know, talking about the book and various events and so on, especially in the context of COVID and a kind of moment of like, well, you know, how do we change our cities? What are some like actual things that we can do? And one of the things that I kind of talk about is like, can we, you know, can we blow up the family and blow up the single family home, basically, right? Can we really finally take a real sort of sledgehammer to this, in part because I think for some people it's the first time that they're confronting the notion that the home is not a safe space, right? Like this is like a sudden realization for some people, like, oh, everybody being locked down in their homes is not safe for like actually a lot of people, that everybody has a home somehow, right? And that everybody can make like choices about you know, how they live in their home. They can use their home for all of these different functions, that, you know, everybody has what they need at home. And so some of these limitations around the idea of the single family home are kind of bubbling up, and we're having more conversations about them. And part of it is around the idea that this form that we have is really meant to serve a group, a population, a demographic that is no longer the majority. So in many cities in Canada, single people are actually the majority of households in the city. In Toronto, it's something like 1/3 of households are single people, right? And the, the single family nuclear home itself is, much less common, right? People either pair up later in life, or they don't pair up at all, or they pair up in different kinds of configurations, or there's not just pairs, there's polyamorous families, we have blended families, step families, distant families, and of course, families that are not based on romantic or intimate partnership. And so in thinking about friendship, it's, one way of starting to unpack that a little bit and asking, like, both what would it mean if people, especially if women, sort of opted out of this form that has been so essentially exploitative to them for so long. Like, that in and of itself is quite radical, but also it would probably precipitate, or it could precipitate, a real push to like living differently, which I think is both like going to be a kind of sustainability imperative as climate change really affects the way that we're, going to be able essentially to live. Like, the single family home is a pretty inefficient way of both doing the care work that we have to do, and of, expending energy, and of using space. Now, it doesn't mean that we all have to like up and move into a commune tomorrow or something. I realize that that does not automatically solve all of these problems, but the fact is the range of options are so limited. So to me, taking that kind of both a feminist and urbanist point of view there is asking questions about, how do the forms that we're stuck with keep reproducing these problematic status quo family forms that are, dangerous at worst and exploitative kind of at best, or at medium, I guess. And if we were to offer a much wider range of forms of, tenancy arrangements, of zoning, of bylaws, of building types, and so on, could we then reimagine what kinship looks like? But of course, there really is, I think, people say, oh, why don't we do that? It's like, well, because that status quo works really well for patriarchy and capitalism and colonialism, right? If we suddenly blow up this form where you don't have somebody doing all of this unpaid care labor in the home, or doing it in heterosexual romantic relationships, right? Doing it based on other forms of solidarity than just who you either gave birth to or have sex with, then it's like the whole system starts to crumble. I mean, in a good way, probably from our perspective, but in a pretty troubling way from the perspective of those who continue to really benefit from all of, just all of the ways that this has been set up. So that's my little rant on that. So I guess, I mean, your question is sort of like, what can we do? I mean, partly it's we can push as citizens for changes to everything from, zoning and developers and the way that they do things. I realize that's not something we can kind of like go out and do today, but if you are moving into professions like planning or urban design or architecture, these are questions that you can ask that a lot of people like in those fields aren't asking at the moment.
Thank you so much for your answer. Our next question is, we were wondering if you had any apprehension about starting off with the chapter titled City of Moms. We were thinking both in terms of reifying the idea that women are necessarily moms or care laborers, but also in terms of women being taken less seriously when they're identified as a mom.
Mm-hmm. To be honest, I did not worry about that in the sense that I felt like I needed to put that chapter where it was, in part because it was part of my personal kind of arc of coming to understand some of these issues, prior to being pregnant, having a baby, trying to navigate the city as a parent. I had certainly, as I say in the book, I'd experienced sexism in the city, but it was like, well, men are the problem, right? And then when I had a baby, it was like, oh, it's not just like sexism from other people, but it's like this whole environment is set up in a way to not facilitate this this way of being, right? To not support me in my work as a parent. And that was the first time that I started to be able to like connect questions about power, sexism, patriarchy, and so on to the space around me, to the actual like physical environment, and to the ways in which our like movement through that environment and the services that environment provides really embody like gendered oppression in many ways. So that was kind of my rationale for putting the chapter there. But the question, or the point that the question is raising, is a really good one. And this is something that I think, you know, I sort of continue to be like walking a bit of line of tension on, is that there's a lot of good arguments to be made for ways in which we could challenge social structures and also the spaces around us to make, you know, what has typically been women's like double shifts, triple shifts easier. But at the same time, like that is not necessarily the radical end goal, right? Just to make it easier for women to keep doing all of the extra labor that they do in society. The goal has to be some kind of radical redistribution of that. So it's this tension between like, okay, what makes people's lives better and easier right now, and what would, you know, really revolutionize the system? Because I think it is very easy to kind of keep slipping back into that conversation of like, well, we just need to put, I don't know, a daycare center in every building or whatever, or like, you know, every few blocks. And like, yes, but it's sort of, it has to be bigger than that as well. And it has to be like some, and I think, you know, COVID again is really showing this both at the kind of individual household level, where all of these reports of like men just literally unable to care for their children in their homes for some reason, like just a total failure of some men, hashtag not all men, I know. But so in that like individual household level, but then broader, more structurally, this like failure of governments to even seemingly comprehend that what we're going through has profound gendered effects, and that the policies that they make, even if they are in the name of public health, have to have that gendered lens. So yeah, I kind of lost my train there again, but yeah, that not wanting to kind of reify that it's like just mothers who are experiencing difficulties as women in the city, but recognizing that this is a much bigger question around essentially care work, and how it's undervalued in every possible way, and how that's even contributed to this crisis, right?
Okay, on to my question. Well, I didn't write the question, but I am reading it for you. And this is on a similar theme as the last question for chapter placement, because we were really intrigued with the decision to place City of Fear as the last chapter, given how fear and safety are ubiquitous tropes when discussing women. Was that a deliberate choice?
Yeah, that was a deliberate choice. Again, a kind of a longstanding tension in feminist urban writing around the city as a place of danger, fear, oppression, exclusion, inequality for women, but also as a place of freedom and autonomy and independence and work and access to all sorts of things, right? And of course, that binary itself is kind of too simplistic, but essentially that has been a long-standing tension both in the literature and I think in popular culture, right? In that we tend to see either one or the other, right? You'll see the kind of like the sex in the city, like enjoyment in the city, freedom, sexual liberation, you know, excitement, consumption, kind of positioning of women in the city, or you'll see like the serial killer kind of, you know, or the you know, the stranger danger story. And we don't see a lot of like, you know, nuanced representations in between that. So I did kind of struggle with, this question. It's like, you can't ignore that topic, obviously, but to place it kind of right up front or to have it take up too much space, I think would have like crowded out opportunities for talking about other sorts of meanings of being in the city. But at the same time, I know like there's probably no chapter where some kind of question of fear and safety does not at least come into it to some extent, right? I think it is inevitably, it lurks, it kind of peeks out at all sorts of different points in the book. But it's, especially, right now, I think it's interesting that there's an opportunity to kind of have a different conversation about women's safety in the city that's been brought on by Black Lives Matter and the call to defund the police, because this raises this question of like, oh, well, what about violence against women? Don't we care about violence against women? That's a real problem. And obviously, yes, it is a real problem. But being able to then speak to this concept of defunding the police and what that might actually mean in terms of, like, in my opinion anyways, actually making a difference in the kinds of things that lead to women being in violent situations, there's kind of no question that, if I had to divide up that pot of money, like, it would not be going to more policing. If my real aim was to end violence against women, it would be going to any number of other things that would actually make a real difference. So it's been interesting in the year, it is almost a year now since the book first came out in Canada, to be able to have an even like more nuanced conversation about what fear and safety is all about, and how we might envision something different than simply trying, and I would say failing, to use the criminal justice system to address the problem of gender-based violence.
Great, thank you for that answer. So the next question is, what are some of the major concerns for feminists in this pandemic, specifically on Turtle Island, and our state's supposed plan for economic recovery? Do you hold any hope for state-led solution or uptake of feminist recovery efforts? Example, Hawaii.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, this has been like such a, an overwhelming theme of so many conversations that I've been having. And I often, get asked some variation of like, do you feel sort of like optimistic? Is this like a moment where things can change, or are things going to get worse? And really, it kind of depends on the day, which side of that I lean on, because I think we've already, 6-8 months in, we've already seen signs of things, going backwards in certain ways. Everything from the, our grocery store billionaire super chains pulling back their like $2 wage increase that they gave to essential workers early in the pandemic, right? So like you have these moments where it's like, okay, there's like a recognition that this is essential work and it's been underpaid and undervalued work. But actually a few months in, we're not doing that anymore, right? Like that's going backwards. And even, something like the CERB here in Canada, which is kind of a step towards the idea of a universal basic income or guaranteed basic income program. We're having all sorts of like, oh, but it shouldn't really be this, it's got to be more like, like we're kind of hedging around it now, instead of saying, oh, hey, this is like a great moment to actually roll this out, which I think would have enormous benefits for women, like in so many ways, right? The idea of like a guaranteed basic income is actually one way of valuing what is currently unpaid work, right? That so many people do, not just women, but saying like, this is valuable work and you're going to get paid even if what you do is stay home and not work, but you're going to get paid, and therefore we're realizing that it's work. So it has that benefit to it. But essentially, I mean, I think, as I was saying earlier, I think this crisis has shown that we have long been in, you know, a kind of slowly simmering crisis of relying not just on all of the unpaid work done in the home, but all of this vastly underpaid and even stigmatized work that's done by women and people of color and recent immigrants, whether it's work in long-term care homes. And certainly, you know, I think in Canada, we have to be absolutely horrified that the vast majority of deaths in this country from COVID have come amongst elderly people in long-term care homes, which is something that could have been prevented. And in part, it was made worse by the fact that people who work in these homes don't make a living wage working in one home, and they had to work at multiple homes, even in the early stages of a pandemic, and they had to do so without proper protective equipment or without the proper resources and time and supports to actually do the work that they need to do in the most safest, most sanitary way. So not only did they put themselves at risk and their families, and of course many healthcare workers and in associated professions around healthcare have contracted COVID, but again, the death count that we've seen is like atrocious that has happened. And I think that's a direct result of that undervaluing and underpaying of all sorts of labor within that sector, right? And of course, the privatization of that sector and corporate control and profit making, all of that sort of thing, but it's all tied together, right? Because if you can have a you know, a feminized or racialized workforce doing this labor, then you're going to increase your profit potential in this world. So to me, the COVID moment is one where we could, as a society, if we want to, really have a serious reckoning with what we understand to be valuable labor, what we understand to be the things that actually support human life and flourishing, what we understand to be the things that support this beast that we call the economy that we also have to protect at all costs, right? So maybe care work is the economy, and this other thing that we call the economy is like kind of a fiction in many ways that would not exist without all of this other labor. But we've been, you know, society is very much set up to hide that. Again, even just going back to the question of like the single family home is the perfect vehicle to hide all of that unpaid labor. So here's a moment where we could have a real reckoning with that. But we're seeing things like, you know, more, you know, potentially hundreds of thousands of women leaving the paid workforce because they can't do everything that they've been told they suddenly have to do because men can't or won't step up and do what they need to do, but also because just as a society, we haven't figured out, or we're unwilling to figure out a way to actually fairly redistribute and provide for that labor in more provide for those care needs in more collective ways. So I realize I've kind of flip-flopped back and forth on how I feel about this. I mean, I think, you know, we can keep talking about it and maybe some change will be made. And I feel like there is a willingness to listen, but again, the power of the status quo is powerful, right?
Thank you for that comment. So the next question, we want to ask if you could share some insights about the kinds of activism happening where you live in New Brunswick to enable women's access to reproductive health. So on implications of recent election, potential closure of Clinic 554.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, talk about your kind of like, you know, Central Canadian Ontario privilege when I first moved out here and kind of learned about, and this was, you know, I moved out here in 2009 and sort of learned about some of what was the state of abortion access in New Brunswick, which was even worse in 2009. Like you still needed doctor's notes in 2009, like not the 1970s, right? In 2009, you still needed like 2 doctors to sign off on having an abortion, like such a paternalistic, patriarch, like I was just horrified, right? Because coming from Ontario, like there just weren't those same kinds of barriers. And of course there's a huge range of ways in which to access all sorts of reproductive health services. Now, of course, I know there, you know, I'm talking about Southern Ontario, right? I know there's huge discrepancies within the province, but coming out here, I was like completely kind of blown away by the situation. And well, it improved a little bit by removing that requirement around, you know, doctors' consent for women to access abortion. We still have a situation where there's only 3 hospitals, so 3 places in New Brunswick to get an abortion, and 2 of them are literally across the street from one another in Moncton. It's a French hospital and an English hospital, right? So 2 of them are literally in the same geographic place, and one of them is in the north of the province. So like even this, so Clinic 554 was in Fredericton, which is the capital of the province, but even there, like that was the only place to get an abortion. So yeah, the province has, even under previous Liberal government and then a minority government, and now we have a majority Conservative government, they've just been completely unwilling to fund Clinic 554 or to, you know, pay for abortions that happen there. They keep calling it a private clinic, like all of this kind of stuff that's just simply not true. So, I mean, at the moment, there is going to be, the Civil Liberties Association is attempting to bring a lawsuit to kind of pressure the government to actually do this. The federal government, despite their, you know, so they withheld a certain amount of the health transfer payments to New Brunswick in order to kind of pressure them. But then when COVID hit, they reinstated those health payments to kind of, because it's going to be a crisis in the healthcare system, but that removed that bit of pressure. So we haven't really seen any other kind of like, you know, like real measures on the part of the federal government to enforce the Canada Health Act here. But at the same time, I think awareness of the issue has grown. There's, I think, a lot of support for expanding abortion access. It may take something like a lawsuit, and then the government can kind of say, oh, well, we were forced to do this. It wasn't our decision. But essentially all over the Maritimes, abortion access is kind of a nightmare. Like there's still literally Facebook groups where people are like, who can pick up a woman at the ferry from Prince Edward Island and drive her to Halifax for this service and take her back? Like, you know, the kind of thing that you think about as like, again, happening in like the 60s and 70s kind of scenario, but it's very real here that we still have these like phone networks of people, you know, literally just trying to like get a ride to across 2 provinces to get the services that they need. Yeah, so it's not great, but there is a lot of like strong activism about it, especially from young people. So there's hope there.
Thank you very much.
I'm aware of the time, although I hate to let you go. I feel like this would have generated some wonderful spontaneous questions also, but it's very late for you. So thank you so much for stopping in. And I want to ask my question, which is the one that I posed to you separately because I forgot about how I wanted to ask it. But as I told the class later too, I think that it would be really fun to generate a like crowdsourced Feminist City playlist that can be released sort of alongside this this video. And so I wanted to ask you, what is your must-have on a Feminist City playlist?
Well, my immediate answer to you when you sent me that email was Cities in Dust by Susie and the Banshees. It's like long been on my sort of like workout playlist, but I kind of love the idea of, she says in the chorus, like, your cities lie in dust, your cities lie in dust. And I think, yeah, you know, like maybe, you know, at least metaphorically, like to think about, you know, starting fresh in different sorts of ways. So that was the one that came to mind for my contribution to the playlist. But I would love to see the playlist and see what other songs people come up with.
There are some good ones. I will share it with you.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you so much, Leslie, for joining us. And we will end it there.
Yeah, thank you everyone for those lovely questions. And it was really nice to meet you. Thank you for your comments about the book. I really appreciate it. Yeah, and thank you for the invitation, Tiffany. It was nice to see you and your students tonight. So
Awesome.
take care, everyone.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.